Okay, so I think that the surge that we're seeing at the moment wasn't totally expected, because it looked like there was a strong seasonal element to it, given that the sort of the local epidemic sort of turned down quite significantly in July. And I guess we're learning some of the sort of the underlying trends and the way and the behavior of this virus within the domestic context that is important to understanding how to progress going forward. So what was clearly going on after the first surge is, after a period of time, as the restrictions were withdrawn, a lot of people felt that they could return to normal behavior. And normal behavior, while the virus still exists in communities, is extremely dangerous. It just doesn't, it's going to resurge the moment people go back into settings in where super spreading is the risk. So certainly my view, and that of quite a few others, is that the way in which this epidemic is driven is through super spreading. It drives up because of super spreading events, not just individuals infecting one or two other people. It's about small numbers of people infecting large numbers of people. And the moment those settings become, people become careless in those settings, it sets off a whole chain reaction of infections. So during a period where the epidemic is quite, where prevalence is quite low, you actually have a lot of high risk super spreading contexts in existence, but might not be super spreading at that point because prevalence is low. So you don't have somebody who's got COVID in the room. But the moment prevalence starts to rise, the probability that somebody with COVID is in one of those settings starts to increase. And so it starts a chain reaction from one super spreading event to another, because the entire environment is exposed to that. It looks as though what people were doing was becoming incredibly careless. I think in shebeens, pubs, also funerals and other gatherings, including just privately organized parties, rave parties, all those things, kind of brought the prevalence up. And people behaving careless in that environment immediately triggered a whole lot of other super spreading events. And suddenly, very quickly, you have an increase. So it began in the Eastern Cape and the Garden route, spread into the Western Cape, where people were actually not cautious enough. And then it went into the other provinces quite quickly, and you see this rise happening more or less at the same time. So the actual timing of the surges are different in each of the provinces from the first surge. So the first surge kind of went from Cape Town through the country, and now it went from the Eastern Cape to Cape Town, to KwaZulu-Natal, to Gauteng, to everywhere, and all the provinces saw a surge in infections, and their rise was very steep. It was an exponential increase. So so because it was driven by gatherings of that form, the restrictions that were implemented, I mean, there are two stages of restrictions. Ones which were applied in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape exclusively first. And then you had the general restrictions and the movement to level 3, which happened in late December. Now you see a bit of an effect of the first set of restrictions in the Western Cape, in that it peaks early, but it's a flat trajectory thereafter. The new infections don't go down steeply; they kind of go sideways. So it stops increasing, but it doesn't go down very rapidly. And a sort of similar trajectory exists in the Eastern Cape. So when the level 3 restrictions were introduced, they were clearly, the underlying rationale was that they were targeting gatherings. They might not have said so. I mean, they did say targeting gatherings, but the alcohol prohibition was an indirect way of targeting gatherings, because what it was doing was effectively stopping on a uniform basis pubs in the suburbs and shebeens in the townships. And it didn't look like people were unevenly treating townships relative to sort of suburbs. But the ban basically makes it, there's no point in basically going to a shebeen or to a pub if you're not going to be able to drink alcohol. The second one that had an impact on gatherings would be a curfew. So the interesting thing about the trajectory that we see now is that in all the provinces, they appear to peak at around about 11 to 13 January, and then on a 7-day moving average go into decline across the board. Now this includes the Western Cape, which also on about the sort of 12th to 13th of January, which was going sideways, drops. And that's clearly an effect of the restrictions themselves. And the Eastern Cape as well. So across the board, you have a single date at which you have a very steep decline occurring that's uniform across the entire country. And I think that's important because it suggests a couple, first of all, it suggests that the gatherings and the super spreading events were actually correctly targeted by the restrictions. They hit the right mark, even though the restrictions probably hit more marks than were relevant to the epidemic. But but they definitely stopped the super spreading events. So I think that becomes very important. Super spreading is the evildoer in this particular pandemic. And if they're not controlled in restaurant settings, in any environment like that, the consequence is going to be a very, very rapid rise. And the slope of the rise is so similar between the first surge and the second surge. So it's not a, 1 or 2 people infecting 4 people. It's 1 person infecting 25 at a time. And that's why that rise goes up. And the moment you kill the super spreading events, it drops at the same rate. So we're currently in that dropping phase. We clearly, the surge was greater in the second period than in the first period, in part, in some instances, because the testing was probably better. The testing hadn't been properly implemented during the initial phase, except in, say, the Western Cape. But but in fact, it appears as though the restrictions prevented Gauteng from having a surge that was greater than the first surge, and they were the biggest in the country. So I think that the restrictions did help bring Gauteng's problem and KwaZulu-Natal's problem under control. KwaZulu-Natal, so I think so this really becomes the challenge then going forward, is really how to make sure that one can differentiate the response, because these restrictions have used a blanket response to target specific gatherings that are high risk. And the question is how to get that effect without shutting everything down. And I think that really becomes the challenge for the industry at this point. The solution going forward will be the vaccines. And there's been a severe problem with government getting its act together on the vaccine program. And so, a lot of us have put a huge pressure on government and their complete incompetence in dealing with vaccines. I'd say that this is an industry, the hospitality industry actually is a high risk industry and actually should be vaccinated as a priority. And but at this point in time, there are questions raised about whether or not government should be the sole procurer of vaccines going forward, or whether industries or other bodies should take initiative and just get access to vaccines and get on with it. There's no law prohibiting that. Once a vaccine has been approved by the SATSA, the regulatory authority that registers these products, theoretically there is no constraint on who purchases them subject to other health laws. So it can be, a vaccine can potentially be organized by people outside of central government. And but I think that it is something that at industry level, different industries should seriously consider where the epidemic places them at higher risk. So not only commercially, but also the vulnerability to infection. So anybody in a restaurant, anybody in a hotel is vulnerable to infection. So I think that given that, serious consideration should be given to actually looking at an industry approach to the rollout and not just sitting back and waiting for government to get its act together. Doesn't mean government won't have stuff on the cards. It means being proactive just means that you're there and can take initiatives when the opportunity is ripe, rather than starting to move when government has delayed things by 3 months. And every month matters in this. So the risk going forward is we will probably address this surge now through these restrictions. They appear to be working. It's also summer, which aids it, which is why in Europe it seems endless. But here it's going down. The problem is going to be when we get to winter, where it's more difficult to contain. These restrictions might need to be considered then again if we don't have a proper rollout of the vaccination program, and the probability looks low at this point that we will have large-scale rollout by that point. So I think that the vaccine strategy from an industry perspective, from a government lobbying perspective, from taking industry action unilaterally, are all things that should be put on the table and considered going forward. Because in preparation for winter, because what we're going to face is these surges every time restrictions are withdrawn. So unless people have modified behavior on their own, realize that certain areas are risks and don't need a government regulation to make them careful. The moment restrictions are withdrawn, we will have a return to former behavior, and it's just a matter of time before we see another resurgence. So I would say it's a high probability of a resurgence in April, May. I would see that the restrictions are withdrawn probably in about 3 to 4 weeks because of it's such a rapid decline, but that isn't going to end it. It's going to be back the moment those restrictions are pulled back, and that becomes our perennial problem. I don't know how one corrects the problem in all of these other areas, and it does suggest that some consideration should be given to proposing to government regulatory interventions that can work on a more long-term basis but protect industries that are much more targeted at the problem. And rather than waiting for them to decide, because they're very slow. And when they react late, they just react with blanket responses. But I do think that once one looks at moving away from level 3, I do think that certain things need to remain in place on an ongoing basis. The question is what? So I think that the question really is, if we target those gatherings, we can probably maintain a longer period of low prevalence. But it does mean that until we've got a vaccine strategy in place, we can't really allow behavior to converge back the way it did this last period. It does appear as though you need some framework in place.